Well, I guess that is the latest news and the big news at the moment, that finally the legislation to create an asset management company has been passed. But this was pretty much anticipated, wasn't it? So just how has the market reacted to the news?
Good morning, Alishia. The market hasn't really reacted to the news yet. In terms of when the news came out yesterday, the market had already closed. But we expect the market to continue its rally today and the rest of the week on the back of that news. But the bill's been passed by the House of Reps, but it still needs to be passed by the Senate. And then if the Senate passes a different bill to what the House of Reps has passed, then it has to be amalgamated together and both bills amended so they make sense. But that's expected to happen in the Senate within the next 2 weeks. So the market is pretty upbeat about that.
Well, we've heard that the AMC would be jointly funded by the Central Bank and the Finance Ministry. It's to be valued at 10 billion naira. The 9 banks rescued last year, though, made provisions of loan losses of more than 2.2 trillion naira by the end of September. So this is not necessarily the ultimate solution here.
It's not. It will help, but there are other things that need to be done. The AMC cannot buy up all the toxic loans in all the banks. It can only buy up some of it. But even then, the AMC, in the way it's been capitalized, as I said, 10 billion naira, will have to issue debt instruments, probably bonds, to be able to raise the funds to buy up these loans. Now, I expect that the debt instruments will have to be backed by the federal government. And so basically, there will be federal government bonds. And that adds to the already quite active federal government lending schedule, where they're issuing quite a lot of bonds this year to cover budget deficit, and with yields already pretty low. For example, 20-year bonds are in 8.5–9% region. This could further depress the yields in the bond market.
Well, of course, the central bank wants new investors to recapitalize these distressed banks, but they're unlikely to do so until all of these bad loans are off their books. So for these distressed banks, where to from here, in your opinion?
In my opinion, the AMC is a good first step. You take up some of the toxic debts in some of these banks and put them on a more even keel. Now, for the rest of the toxic debts they have to either be restructured or come to some kind of agreement with potential new investors, because no new investor is going to sink in new capital to pay for bad loans. So there has to be some accommodation either through restructuring or more aggressive loan recovery program from the banks to try and put them on more even keel for the foreign investors. I think when the stock market starts inching up as it is now, it also improves the toxic loan situation of many of the banks, because many of the bad loans are actually in equities. And as the stock market continues to inch up, obviously the loan book looks better.
Well, in this context then, Kayode, how are you playing the banks at the moment? Because yesterday we certainly saw the likes of Intercontinental, Oceanic and Union Bank under pressure.
I think you're looking at the banks that scale the hurdle. They fall into 2 categories. You have the banks that are pretty big, like First Bank and UBA, who they're probably going to raise maybe some more capital through debt instruments, but they're in fairly good condition. Then you have the smaller players like Diamond Bank, who are positioning themselves, Diamond Bank and Access Bank, who are positioning themselves to maybe take on some of these rescue banks and acquire size. Then you have the rescued banks. Among the rescue banks, you have banks like Union Bank, Intercontinental, Oceanic, which are quite large banks that have large branch network, and investors will be very keen to attract those banks, either domestic investors or new investors. So they'll be quite attractive to banks. I think if investors are taking positions on those banks, expecting that to happen. The smaller banks that have been rescued, they're in a more difficult position because they haven't really got the reach of the Intercontinentals, Oceanics, and the Union Bank, or the history. And so they might be more difficult to sell. Well,
amongst the top tier banks, I mean, standing in the spotlight seems to be Guarantee Trust Bank. I spoke with the Deputy Managing Director of the bank, Olukayode Akindele, yesterday, and certainly the bank seems to have a solid plan in place moving forward. Your quick view on GTBank in specific?
I think GTBank is probably one of the big winners in this banking reform. They've always had a good strategy. They had a good succession plan, which they enacted when the founding MD stepped aside for the deputy MD to then attain. So they have a good succession planning. They have a very good strategy and very clear strategy, which is really high corporate end and retail banking, and which they've done very well with. And I think with their bond issuance, both a Euro bond as well as a domestic bond, and being one of the first people to do both of them quite successfully, I think they've set themselves on quite a pedestal for others to follow.